3 of my ships died in the first minute. I did not have time to grieve them. I had time to shout one order, and then the 4th ship died too, and the numbers stopped meaning anything. My name is Vern Kessaren. I command what is left of the Korvath fleet, and on the day this story begins, what was left of the Korvath fleet was burning. The enemy did not have a name we understood. We called them the Ashvale, because that is what they left behind. Gray drifting fields where cities used to spin in orbit. They came in swarms of small fast ships that moved like one mind wearing 3,000 bodies, and nothing we built could outthink that mind, because it did not think the way anything alive thinks. It simply arrived, and then it erased, and then it moved on to the next system, on a route none of us could predict. On the bridge of my flagship, the air smelled of scorched wiring. My sensor officer, a steady man named Torin who had never once raised his voice in 40 years of service, made a sound I had never heard him make. Small, cracked, not a word. I looked at the display. 900 ships remained out of the 2,000 we had gathered to make a stand. The Ashvale swarm had not even slowed down. There is a treaty buried in our archives. Nobody in the assembly likes to speak its true terms out loud, because speaking them feels like an invitation. It was written 40 years ago by a woman named Speaker Dawn, after our first contact with a species from a small blue world at the edge of known space. She came home from that meeting different, quieter. She would not describe what she saw during their military exercises, only that it was enough to make her write one clause into a treaty and refuse to explain it to anyone. The clause says this: only if there is nothing left to lose. I stood on my dying bridge with 900 ships and a swarm that did not tire, and I understood, the way you understand cold water closing over your head, that we had reached the bottom of that sentence. I opened the emergency channel. I said 4 words that had never once been spoken by anyone in Korvath history. We invoke Directive 9. Then I closed the channel and waited to find out what we had done. Nobody slept that night, not because of the Ashvale. The swarm did not stop for the transmission. It kept coming, patient the way erosion is patient, and by the time the sun of that system rose again, we had lost another 40 ships, and the reply had still not come. Torin kept the same seat, the same steady hands, but his voice had thinned to something I did not recognize. "Fleet Speaker," he said, "there is a contact. 1 ship," he told me. 1 single ship, dropping out of the dark at the edge of our formation, and it had not announced itself to us at all. It was talking to the Ashvale. "We got your location," the message said. 4 words, broadcast on every frequency the swarm used, delivered flat, the way you might tell a stranger their ride had arrived outside. I stared at the ship on the display. It was smaller than our smallest cruiser. No visible weapons bloom, no shield signature at all, as if the crew inside had never once considered the possibility of being hit and had built nothing to prepare for it. Torin's hands stopped moving on his console. "Fleet Speaker," he said, "it is not broadcasting a crew manifest." "How many aboard?" I asked him. "1," he said. I did not have an answer that fit inside that word, so I said nothing, and the ship kept closing the distance, unhurried, the way something walks toward a fight it has already finished in its own mind. I want to describe the battle that followed the way it deserves to be described, and I have tried more than once, and each attempt falls apart in the same place. Here is what I can give you honestly. The Ashvale fought as a swarm, 3,000 small craft acting as a single intelligence none of us had ever managed to break or predict. You could not flank it. You could not bait it into a trap, because it had no fear to exploit and no pride to wound. It simply existed, everywhere at once, grinding forward like weather. The single human ship did not fight the swarm the way we fought the swarm. It fought the space the swarm was standing in. Before the Ashvale even reached firing range, something had already been laid into the dark ahead of them. No visible deployment, no warning flare. When the swarm entered that patch of empty vacuum, the vacuum itself came apart in total silence. No detectable strike signature, no target lock any of our systems could trace. Ships simply stopped existing, the way a held breath simply stops. Torin quit calling out the falling numbers somewhere past 4,000 Ashvale craft. Not because his voice broke, because there was nothing left worth counting. My tactical officer, a sharp young woman named Aura Vel, tried to log an engagement pattern for the record, and sat in silence for a long moment, before she gave up trying. "There is no pattern, Fleet Speaker," she finally said. "There is only an outcome." I wrote that sentence into the official log exactly as she said it. I still do not have anything better to put beside it. 2 hours into the engagement, with the Ashvale swarm reduced to a scattered field of husks, I opened a direct channel to the human vessel, meaning to offer thanks, meaning to sound like a leader receiving an ally. A voice answered before I had finished forming my greeting. Young, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of the day. "You are welcome," she said. "Location is clear. You will be finding debris out there for a week. Do not touch the black canisters. They are not finished yet." "Not finished," I repeated. "They are still working," she said. I understood then, slow and cold, that whatever had unmade 3,000 ships in total silence had not stopped working, that it was patient, that it did not know the difference between an enemy hull and a rescue shuttle sent to gather our dead. I asked her to disable it. There was a pause on the line, not hesitation. Recalculation, the way you pause before telling someone a stove is hot after they have already reached toward it. "They will go dormant in 9 days, she said. "That is the fastest window I have got for you." 9 days, I said, in a debris field where my people will be pulling their dead out from among the wreckage. "Then start recovery from the outer edge, and work inward," she said, a short breath. "I am sorry it is not gentler. It was not built to be gentle. It was built to end things." I said nothing. There was no shape of silence built correctly for that sentence. Then, quieter, almost to herself, not meant for the open channel but caught on it all the same, she said 4 more words. First one that worked exactly like the manual said it would. Those 4 words did something to me that 6 hours of massacre had not managed to do, as if annihilation were a specification written on a page somewhere, as if what had erased the Ashvale in total silence was not a triumph to her at all, but a routine test, finally passing after however many that had failed before it. I closed the channel. Oravel was watching my face. She did not ask what had been said. I think she already knew, the way you know a smell before you find the words to name it. The Assembly wants to call it a victory. Someone on the Council has already proposed a monument at the coordinates where the battle happened. I voted against it, and not because I am ungrateful. I voted against it because of a very specific dread that I have not yet found the right words, or the right committee, to say out loud. We spent 40 years afraid of the Ashvale, and rightly so. They took whole systems the way weather takes a coastline, without malice, without pause, without any version of themselves that could be spoken to or reasoned with. Now I lie awake with a different kind of arithmetic keeping me from sleep. The Ashvale needed 3,000 ships and 6 hours to do what one single human vessel undid in 2. And for the length of exactly 1 sentence, the woman piloting that vessel sounded pleased, not with the victory itself, with the craftsmanship of it, the tone of someone checking that a tool performed exactly as its instructions had promised it would. Old Speaker Don's clause returns to me differently now than it did when I first read it as a young officer training to inherit this seat. Only if there is nothing left to lose. I used to believe it was a rule about desperation, about the threshold a person must cross before they are allowed to ask for help. I understand now that it was a rule about arithmetic, about what happens to you after you have finally seen the thing you called for. You do not get to be afraid of the Ashvale in quite the same way again. You have met something the Ashvale themselves would have called backup, if the Ashvale had ever once thought to be afraid of anything at all. We know better now. The ship that answered our call did not leave immediately. That should have comforted me, and instead it kept me standing on the bridge long after Torin and Oravel had gone to rest, watching a small unarmed silhouette drift among our wreckage like it belonged there. 3 days after the battle, it requested docking clearance at my flagship, not a demand. A request, polite in its wording, almost formal, which struck me as strange after everything I had witnessed. I granted it before I had fully decided whether I wanted to. The woman who stepped off that ship did not look like what I expected. I do not know what I expected. Something taller, perhaps. Something built for what she had done. Instead, she was ordinary, in the way a knife left on a kitchen counter is ordinary, until you remember what a knife is for. Her name was Grace Holloway. She told me this before I asked. The way you offer a name to someone you intend to keep talking to. She walked our corridors slowly, hands folded behind her back, reading the scorch marks on our walls the way a scholar reads old text. She stopped at a section of hull that had nearly buckled during the fighting, and pressed 2 fingers against it, gently, almost like an apology. I asked her how old she was. It felt like a strange question to lead with, but it was the one that would not stay quiet in my chest. 29, she said. Old enough for this. Young enough that it still costs something. I did not understand the second half of that sentence yet. I would come to understand it later, and wish that I had not. We walked together to what remained of our command deck, and she looked at the star charts we kept, and she asked questions that were sharper than any diplomat's questions had ever been. Not about our resources, not about our territory, about the Ashvale's movement patterns, about the frequency of their incursions, about how long we had known, and how long we had waited before we asked anyone for help. 40 years, I told her. We waited 40 years. She was quiet for a moment. That is a long time to bleed alone, she said. I asked her why her people had come at all, when our treaty with them had sat unused for 4 decades, a clause nobody wanted to invoke. She looked at me directly then, and something in her face closed like a door being pulled shut from the inside. Because somebody finally asked, she said. That is usually all it takes with us. Somebody has to ask. I wanted to ask what that meant. I wanted to ask what her people had built themselves into, out on that small blue world nobody in our star charts had thought worth watching. But something in the set of her shoulders told me the question would cost more than I was ready to pay, and so I let it sit unanswered between us, the way you let a wound sit unbandaged when you are not yet ready to look at how deep it goes. Grace Holloway stayed 11 days. I did not ask her to. I think, looking back, none of us knew how to ask her to leave either, and so the question simply never got spoken by anyone. On the 3rd day, a young engineer named Owen Ferris approached her in the mess hall with a question about the black canisters still sitting dormant in our debris field. He was not trying to provoke her. He was trying to understand something that terrified him, the way people probe a bruise to see how much it still hurts. What are they? He asked her. Really, not the safety briefing version. Grace set down the cup she was holding. Slow, deliberate, the way you set something down when you want your hands free for what comes next. They are called seed mines, she said. They read the shape of a ship's drive signature and decide, in less time than it takes you to blink, whether that shape belongs to something that is trying to kill people. If the answer is yes, the ship stops being a ship. If the answer is no, the ship never even knows the mine was there. Owen's next question came out smaller than he probably intended. Who taught the mine what killing looks like? He asked. Grace was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer at all. We did, she finally said. It took us a long time to get right. A lot of ships that were not supposed to stop, stopped, before we go it right. Nobody in that mess hall spoke for a long moment. Owen looked down at his tray like it had suddenly become the only safe thing to look at. I am sorry, Grace said, and her voice had gone flatter, the way a voice goes flat when a person has said sorry enough times that the word has worn a groove into them. I am sorry, that is the honest answer. You asked for the honest one. She left the mess hall without finishing her meal. I watched her go, and thought about the word groove, about a sentence worn smooth from overuse, and I understood that this was not the first mess hall on some other world where a young person had asked her that same question. On the 5th day, I finally asked her the question I had been circling since she first stepped off her ship. Your people. How many of you are there, out among the stars, doing what you did to the Ashvale? She smiled, and it was not a happy expression. It was the kind of smile a person wears when they are choosing which true thing to say out of several true things available to them. Not many out here yet, she said. We are careful about where we go. We learn to be careful the hard way. Careful, I repeated. That word did not match anything I had witnessed in the debris field outside my ship. She looked at me directly, and something in her eyes had gone very old, older than a 29-year-old face should be able to hold. Careful does not mean gentle, Commander, she said. It means we do not go where we are not asked. It means once we are asked, we finish the job completely, the first time, so nobody has to ask twice. Every time we did it halfway, in the old days, back home, it cost more the second time around. We do not do things halfway anymore. I asked her what home had cost her people, to learn a lesson like that. She did not answer with a story. She answered with 4 words, delivered flat, and then she changed the subject before I could ask a follow-up, the way you slam a door before wind can get through it. Everything, she said. It cost everything. I let the subject drop. Some doors, once you understand the size of what is behind them, you do not push on twice. On the 7th day, our long-range sensors picked up a second ashvale formation, smaller than the first, moving on a course that would bring it through a neighboring system, inhabited by a species we had traded with for generations. Not Korvath territory, not our fight, by any treaty either side had ever signed. Grace was in the observation deck when the alert came through. She read the trajectory over Oravel's shoulder without being invited to, and her posture changed in a way I had not seen before. Not fear. Something quieter and more clinical, like a person doing arithmetic they had done many times and did not enjoy doing again. That is Velkos territory, Oravel said. We have no obligation there. Grace did not look up from the display. I do, she said. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody had invoked any directive on her behalf. The Velkos were not signatories to whatever treaty her people held with mine, and yet she was already moving toward the corridor that led back to her ship before Oravel had finished speaking the coordinates aloud. I followed her. I do not fully know why. Perhaps I wanted to understand what kind of creature moves toward a fight nobody has called them into. Why? I asked her. At the airlock, as her ship's systems began to hum awake around her. She paused with one hand on the frame of the door, and for a moment, she looked less like the weapon I had watched unmake 3,000 ships, and more like a tired young woman standing in a doorway deciding whether to explain herself to a stranger. Because I can see it happening, and I have the means to stop it, she said. Where I come from, once you have both of those things at the same time, you do not get to look away and call it someone else's problem. We tried that once. For a long time. It did not go well for anyone, including us. She stepped through the airlock. The door sealed behind her with a sound too small for what it meant. I stood there a long moment after the sound of her engines had faded from our hull sensors, thinking about the shape of a person who could not look away, and wondering whether that shape was a gift to a galaxy still bleeding from the ash veil, or the beginning of a debt none of us had yet worked out how to pay. Oravel found me still standing at the airlock some time later. Fleet speaker, she said, carefully. Should we follow her? I thought about the black canisters still lying dormant in our own debris field. I thought about the word careful, and the word everything, and the 4 words that had done more to unsettle me than the massacre itself. First one that worked exactly like the manual said it would. No, I told Oravel, we stay here. We finish burying our dead. She did not argue. I think she understood, the way I was beginning to understand, that there are certain currents in the galaxy you do not follow, simply because you are curious where they lead. You wait, instead, to see what they bring back with them. What came back, 4 days later, was a transmission from the Velkos system, brief and formal, thanking the Korvath fleet for what it called our intervention. I had sent no ships. I had sent no message. Grace Holloway had never once mentioned the Korvath name during whatever had happened out there, and yet the credit had landed on us anyway, the way spray from a wave lands on shore even when the wave itself has already pulled back out to sea. I did not correct them. I am still not entirely certain why. When Grace returned to dock with my flagship one final time, before she departed our system for good, she looked different in a way I could not name at first, and then realized I could. She looked the way Torin had looked after the first 6 hours of the Ashvale battle. Not injured. Simply used, the way a tool looks used, worn faintly along the edges from doing exactly the work it was built to do, over and over, without complaint, because complaint had never once been part of the design. I asked her if the Velkos engagement had gone the way she wanted. She considered the question longer than I expected. Nobody died who was not already trying to make other people die, she said. That is the best outcome I know how to aim for anymore. I used to aim higher. I learned not to. I did not ask what higher had looked like, or what had taught her to stop reaching for it. I had already learned, over 11 days, which questions she would answer honestly, and which ones she would answer with silence dressed up as an answer, and I had come to respect the difference too much to keep pushing past it. She left 3 hours later. I watched her ship shrink to a point of light on our long-range display, and then to nothing at all. and I found myself thinking, with a coldness that surprised me, that I was glad she was gone, and equally glad that if the Ashvale ever returned in force, I now knew exactly which 4 words to send out into the dark. 6 months passed before the Ashvale returned in force, and when they did not come alone. We detected the new formation first, as a single anomaly on our outer sensor net, a shape moving faster than anything the swarm had ever managed before. Oravel called me to the bridge before the sun had fully risen over the flagship's hull, and her voice carried none of the calm she usually kept wrapped around herself like armor. "Fleet speaker," she said, "the swarm has changed." I looked at the display and understood immediately why her calm had cracked. The Ashvale ships were no longer moving as 3,000 separate points acting in unison. They had merged, somehow, into fewer and larger vessels, each one carrying the mass of 100 smaller craft, folded into a single hull. We had never seen them do this before. We had never even suspected they were capable of it. "Something taught them to adapt," Torin said, quiet, from his station. "Something showed them what it looks like to lose badly enough that losing again was not an option." I understood what he meant without him needing to finish the thought. The Ashvale had watched us call for help 6 months earlier. They had watched a single human vessel undo an entire swarm in the space of 2 hours. Whatever intelligence guided that hive mind, it had learned from the encounter the same way we had, and it had spent 6 months building something specifically shaped to survive what had beaten it before. We did not have the numbers to face this. Our fleet, rebuilt slowly across half a year of mourning and repair, stood at barely 600 ships. The formation approaching us carried a mass equivalent to the original 3,000, compressed into 40 vessels that our scanners could not fully read. I gave the order before I had finished thinking it through completely. "Invoke Directive 9, I told Oravel. "Send it wide. Do not wait for my confirmation on the wording. Send it now." She did not question me. She simply sent it, and then we waited, watching the new Ashvale formation close the distance a full 3 hours faster than the old swarm ever had. The reply, when it came, was not what I expected. It was not 1 ship this time. It was 12, dropping into our system in a formation so precise, it looked less like a fleet arriving and more like a single machine unfolding itself across the dark. At the front of the formation, unmistakable even at this distance, sat the same small, unarmed silhouette I remembered from 6 months earlier. Grace Holloway's voice came through on an open channel, before the formation had even finished settling into position. "Told my people what I saw out here," she said. "They wanted to see it for themselves this time." Behind her voice, I could hear other voices, layered and overlapping, the sound of a crew coordinating across a network larger than anything my own communications officers had ever managed. I heard names called out: Daniel, Laura, Nathan. Ordinary names, spoken quickly, urgently, belonging to people I had never met and would likely never see, working somewhere behind Grace's voice to bring whatever they had built to bear against the thing bearing down on my system. The battle that followed lasted 4 hours, and it was nothing like the silent, almost gentle unmaking I had witnessed 6 months before. This time the Ashvale's new hulls fought back. This time there was noise, visible weapons fire, hull breaches that our own sensors could track and measure, and for the first stretch of that battle, I genuinely did not know which side would still be standing when it ended. I watched 2 of the 12 human ships take damage, severe enough that they fell out of formation entirely, venting atmosphere in long silver trails against the dark. I heard Grace's voice go tight across the channel, heard her call a name: "Laura, are you reading me? Laura, respond," and heard the relief flood back into her tone seconds later, when a tired voice answered that she was reading, that she was alive, that the hull would hold a while longer. That exchange did something to me that the earlier silent massacre never had. It told me these were not machines performing a function. They were people, afraid in the same way my own crew had been afraid, holding a line because someone had asked them to, and because they had decided, individually and together, that the asking mattered enough to answer. By the 3rd hour, the merged Ashvale hulls had begun to fracture under whatever the human fleet was throwing against them, splitting back down into the smaller units they had originally been built from, as if the adaptation itself had a cost the swarm could not sustain indefinitely. Once the fracturing began, it spread fast. and within another 40 minutes the formation that had approached with the mass of 3,000 ships had been reduced to drifting wreckage. Grace's voice came through one final time, as the last Ashvale signature faded from our sensors. "Location's clear, Commander," she said, and her voice sounded thinner than it had 6 months earlier, worn down by 4 hours of a fight that had cost her people 2 badly damaged ships and, I would learn later, 3 lives that did not survive the return trip home. I offered my condolences across the open channel, formally, the way protocol required. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "Thank you," she said. "It does not get easier to hear that, no matter how many times someone offers it." I asked her, because I could not stop myself, whether the cost had been worth it, whether her people ever weighed the toll of these engagements against the systems they were sent to protect. "Every single time," she said. "That is the part nobody outside my fleet ever really understands. We do not do this because it costs nothing. We do it because we decided a long time ago that some costs are worth paying anyway, and once you decide that, you do not get to keep redeciding it every time the price goes up. You just keep paying it." I did not have a response worthy of that sentence, so I offered none, and she did not seem to expect one. 3 days later, before the human fleet departed our system, Oravel approached me privately, her expression carrying a weight I had not seen on her since the earliest hours of the first Ashvale massacre. "Fleet Speaker," she said, "I have been reviewing the sensor logs from the battle. There is something you should see before they leave." She showed me the readings, quiet, careful, the way you hand someone something breakable. Buried within the human fleet's engagement pattern, hidden beneath the visible weapons fire and the hull breaches we had all watched unfold, our systems had detected a secondary layer of activity, something moving through the wreckage of the fractured Ashvale hulls, even as the battle continued around it. Something methodical, patient, cataloging. "They were studying it," Oravel said. "While they were fighting it, part of their fleet was already taking it apart to understand how it adapted. They were fighting the war and preparing for the next one at the same time." I sat with that information a long while before I spoke again. "Do you think they always do that?" I asked her. "Every engagement, fighting and studying in the same breath." "I think," Oravel said, choosing her words with visible care, "that a people who can build something as final as those seed mines did not learn to do it by only fighting the fight in front of them. I think they have been fighting the next fight, and the one after that, for a very long time. I think that is simply how they have learned to survive being what they are." I thought of Grace's 4 quiet words from 6 months earlier. First one that worked exactly like the manual said it would. I thought of the word everything, offered flat and final in answer to a question about what her people's history had cost them. I thought of a species that met catastrophe, and did not simply survive it, but sat down afterward, and built an instrument specifically engineered, never to lose that particular fight again. I understood, sitting there with Oravel's readings still glowing on the display between us, that the Ashvale were no longer the thing that frightened me most about the dark beyond our borders. They had been weather. Terrible, patient, unreasoning weather. What Grace Holloway's people had built themselves into, across whatever history had taught them the word everything, was not weather at all. It was intention. Cold, careful, endlessly adapting intention, aimed with total precision at anything foolish enough to threaten the people who had asked it for help. I did not know, sitting in that quiet room with Oravel, whether we had summoned an ally or a mirror. I only knew that I would spend a very long time trying to work out the difference, and that some nights, when the flagship was quiet and the corridors held only the hum of the engines, I was no longer entirely certain I wanted to know the answer. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with someone in the assembly who believed a good idea and a wise idea were the same thing. His name was Counselor Bram Aldous, a man who had never once stood on a bridge during an Ashvale engagement, but who had studied the sensor logs of both battles with an intensity that unsettled me from the moment he requested a private meeting. He arrived aboard my flagship 8 days after the human fleet's departure, carrying a data slate thick with proposals, and he wasted no time laying out the shape of what he wanted. "We should ask them to teach us," he said. "The seed mines, the adaptive hull technology. If we understood even a fraction of it, Fleet Speaker, we would never need to send that call out into the dark again. We could stand on our own." I told him it was not our technology to ask for, and he waved the objection aside, the way you wave aside an insect that has not yet learned to bite. They gave it to us freely once already, he said. Twice, if you count the Velkos engagement. What is the harm in asking? I thought of Grace Holloway standing in my corridor, one hand on the frame of an airlock, telling me that her people did not do things halfway anymore, because halfway had cost them dearly in the past. I thought of the word careful, and how carefully she had chosen every single thing she told me across 11 days, offering truth in pieces small enough that I could hold them without being cut. The harm, I told Counselor Aldous, is that we do not yet understand what that technology cost the people who built it. Until we understand the cost, we have no business asking to carry the weight of it ourselves. He did not agree with me. I watched him leave that meeting with his jaw set in a way I recognized from decades of assembly politics, the particular stubbornness of a man who has already decided he is right, and is merely waiting for circumstances to prove it. 3 weeks later, circumstances handed him exactly what he wanted. A small Corvath research vessel, operating near the edge of the debris field left behind by the second Ashvale engagement, recovered a fragment of one of the fractured hulls. Not human technology. Ashvale technology, altered by whatever the humans had done to it during the battle, still carrying faint traces of the process that had unmade it. Aldous brought the fragment before the full assembly within days, arguing that studying it, even without the humans' consent, violated no treaty and cost us nothing. I argued against it. I lost the vote by a narrow margin, and the research began 3 days later under a classification so tight that even I, as fleet speaker, was granted only partial access to what the research teams found. I did not learn the full truth of what happened until Grace Holloway returned to our system 4 months after that, this time without warning, her small, unarmed ship dropping out of the dark alone, the way it had the very first time, and I understood before she had even opened a channel that something had gone badly wrong. She requested docking clearance in a tone I had not heard from her before, not tired, not weary in the familiar way I had come to recognize, something colder, more controlled, the particular stillness of a person holding something back with great effort. I met her at the airlock myself. She stepped through without her usual small courtesies, no greeting, no acknowledgement of the months since we had last stood in this corridor together, and the first words out of her mouth landed like a hand closing around my throat. "You've been studying live samples of adapted swarm tissue," she said, "in an unshielded research facility, 11 kilometers from a civilian population center." I did not know how to answer her, because I genuinely had not known, and the not knowing must have shown plainly enough on my face, because something in her posture eased very slightly, the anger redirecting itself rather than draining away. "You did not authorize this," she said. It was not a question. "No," I told her. "I voted against the research entirely. I was overruled." She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something quieter and far more dangerous than the anger that had come before it. "I need you to understand something, Commander, and I need you to understand it completely, because I am only going to explain this once, and then I am going to need your help fixing it. That tissue is not inert. It does not stop adapting simply because it has been separated from the rest of the swarm. Left alone, in an environment with even trace amounts of ambient energy, it will begin reconstructing itself. Slowly, at first, then not slowly at all." I asked her how she knew this with such certainty. "Because we made this mistake ourselves," she said, and something in her face closed the way it had closed once before, at an airlock, 6 months and a lifetime ago. A very long time back, before the seed mines, before we learned to finish things completely instead of studying them halfway. We lost a research station, 40,000 people. It took us 3 days to understand what was happening, and by the time we did, there was no station left to save. The number sat in the air between us like something physical. 40,000. I thought of my own flagship, of Torin's steady hands, of Oravel's careful eyes, and tried to imagine that number, and could not make my mind hold the shape of it. "That," she said, quiet now, almost gentle, "is what everything cost. That is the word I would not explain to you the first time you asked." I did not explain it, because there was no version of the explanation that would not have sounded like I was trying to frighten you into obedience. I did not want that between us. I wanted you to trust the caution because you understood it, not because I had scared you into it. I asked her, my voice not entirely steady, whether the fragment in our research facility was already reconstructing itself. Yes, she said. It started 6 days ago. Your people do not have instruments sensitive enough to have detected it yet. Mine do. That is why I am here, and that is why I need you to authorize my access to that facility within the hour, before this becomes the same story we already lived through once. I gave the authorization before she had finished the sentence. What followed was the strangest 6 hours of my command. Grace moved through our research facility with a small team from her own ship, people whose names I finally learned properly in the crisis that followed. A quiet engineer named Nathan Cole who spoke almost entirely in numbers, and a sharp, exhausted woman named Laura Bennett, who I recognized from the earlier battle. Her voice the one Grace had called out for across an open channel, while their ships burned. They worked with a coordination that unsettled me even as it reassured me. 3 people moving as if they shared a single set of instincts built from a disaster none of them had personally lived through, but all of them had clearly been taught to fear with total precision. Counselor Aldous arrived partway through, furious, demanding explanations, insisting that this was Korvath research on Korvath soil, and that the humans had no authority to simply seize control of it. Grace did not look up from her work when she answered him. "You are welcome to file a complaint through whatever channel you like, Counselor," she said. "File it after we finish making sure this facility does not do to your people what a very similar mistake once did to 40,000 of mine. I will be happy to discuss jurisdiction with you once nobody's life depends on how quickly this conversation ends." He did not have an answer for that. Neither, in the end, did I. By the time the crisis had passed, the tissue sample neutralized and the facility sealed under a containment protocol Grace's team left behind, along with careful, patient instructions, something had shifted permanently in how I understood the people who had answered our call. I had spent a year believing I was watching a species defined by the terrible things they were capable of doing to their enemies. Standing in that research facility, watching Laura Bennett kneel beside a young Korvath technician who had nearly triggered the reconstruction herself and had not yet stopped shaking, watching her speak softly, patiently, telling the girl that none of this was her fault, that nobody had told her what she needed to know to be safe, I understood that I had been watching the wrong half of the story all along. The seed mines were not the whole truth of what Grace Holloway's people had built themselves into. The whole truth was this. Somewhere in their history sat a wound large enough to hold 40,000 names, and everything I had witnessed since the day their ship first answered our call, the precision, the caution, the terrible finality of the seed mines, the refusal to do anything halfway, all of it had grown directly out of that single wound, the way scar tissue grows thick and careful over a place that once nearly killed you. They were not monsters because they enjoyed what they had become. They were monsters because monsters were the only shape that had ever kept the people they loved alive. And once you have found a shape that works, once you have paid the price that shape demanded of you, you do not set it down again, simply because it frightens the people watching from outside. I did not tell Counselor Aldous this. I do not think he would have understood it as anything other than an excuse. I kept it instead, the way you keep something too heavy to carry openly, folded small and pressed close, and I carried it with me back to the bridge of my flagship, where Grace Holloway was waiting to say goodbye, for what I understood, even then, would not be the last time. 2 years have passed since the research facility. I am writing this account now, alone, in the quiet hours before the assembly convenes to vote on something that will decide the shape of our alliance for a generation, and I find myself needing to set down what I have learned before I stand in front of them and speak. The Ashvale have not returned. Whether that is because the swarm learned, finally and completely, that our system carried a cost too high to pay again, or because something else entirely drove them elsewhere, none of us can say with certainty. Grace Holloway believes it is the former. She told me once, over a comm channel stretched thin across half a galaxy, that swarms like the Ashvale operate on something close to instinct even at their most sophisticated, and instinct, once burned badly enough, tends to remember the shape of the fire far longer than it remembers anything else. I hope she is right. I do not entirely believe hope changes anything, but I have found, across these 2 years, that hoping alongside someone who has actually survived the thing you fear is different from hoping alone in the dark. Counselor Aldous resigned his seat 6 months after the research facility crisis. He did not resign quietly, and he did not resign in agreement with me. He resigned believing the assembly had grown too cautious, too willing to let fear of the human's history dictate the shape of our own ambitions. I do not know if history will judge him fairly or unfairly. I only know that I do not miss the particular flavor of certainty he carried into every room he entered. Aura Vel commands her own vessel now, one of 12 new cruisers built from a design our engineers developed in careful, consensual collaboration with a small team from Grace's fleet. People who insisted on being present for every stage of construction, who checked and rechecked every safety protocol with an obsessiveness that used to frustrate our own engineers until they finally understood, the way I had finally understood, exactly what that obsessiveness had cost to earn. Torin retired last spring. He asked me, before he left the bridge for the final time, whether I thought the humans would have come if Speaker Don had never written that clause into the treaty 40 years before any of us needed it. I told him I did not know, and that was true. I still do not know. I think about it more often than I let anyone see. What I do know, what I have carried with me across these 2 years, the way you carry a stone worn smooth by handling, is this. We asked for backup, and backup arrived, and what arrived was not the simple rescue any of us had imagined when we first opened that emergency channel with 3 of our ships already burning. What arrived was a mirror, and mirrors do not care whether you are ready to see what they show you. Grace Holloway visits our system twice a year now, not as a soldier answering a distress call, but as something closer to what I have started, privately, to call a friend. Though I do not know if the word translates cleanly enough between our 2 species to mean the same thing on both sides of the conversation. She brings Nathan Cole sometimes, and Laura Bennett, and once, memorably, a quiet young man named Daniel Pierce, who spent 3 full days simply walking our gardens without saying very much at all, until on the final evening he told me, unprompted, that his own homeworld had lost every garden it once had during the years his people call the long winter, and that ours was the first he had walked through in a long time that did not feel like it was mourning something. I did not ask him to explain the long winter. I have learned, across 2 years of careful friendship with people who carry histories too heavy to hand over all at once, that some doors open on their own timeline, and that pushing on them before they are ready only teaches the person on the other side to keep them shut more firmly next time. Tonight, the Assembly will vote on a proposal to formalize what has, until now, existed only as an unspoken understanding between our peoples, a true alliance, shared defense protocols, joint research, conducted this time with full consent and full partnership, rather than the reckless unilateral grasping that nearly cost us a second research facility disaster. Counselor Aldous, whatever his flaws, was not entirely wrong that closer cooperation could make us stronger. He was only wrong about the price such cooperation demands, and the patience required to pay that price honestly, instead of trying to steal a shortcut through it. I intend to vote in favor of the proposal. I do not do so with easy confidence. I do so with the particular clarity that comes from having stood, more than once now, in a room with people capable of ending 3,000 ships in total silence, and having watched those same people kneel beside a frightened technician and speak to her with more gentleness than I have shown some of my own crew after difficult days. I used to believe the galaxy's greatest danger wore the shape of the ash veil, a swarm without mercy, without reason, without anything in it a person could appeal to. I no longer believe that, and I do not think I ever will again. The ash veil were terrible because they could not choose otherwise. There was no decision buried anywhere inside that hive intelligence, no moment where it weighed a cost and chose to pay it anyway. It simply was what it was, the way weather simply is what it is, and you cannot call something a monster that never once had the option to be anything else. Grace Holloway's people had the option. They had lived through a wound large enough to hold 40,000 names, and they had faced a choice afterward that I do not think any of us can fully understand until we have stood where they stood. They could have become smaller, quieter. They could have retreated behind whatever borders remained to them and let the rest of the galaxy handle its own catastrophes from a safe and careful distance. Instead, they built the seed mines. They built the adaptive hulls. They built a fleet that answers, every single time, when somebody finally asks, because somewhere in the wreckage of their own worst day, they decided that looking away from someone else's worst day was a cost they were no longer willing to let themselves pay, no matter what it demanded of them in return. That is not the shape of a monster in the way I once used that word. It is the shape of something far stranger and far harder to hold at a comfortable distance. It is the shape of a people who walked through their own ending and came out the other side having decided, with total and terrible clarity, exactly what they were willing to become in order to make sure nobody else had to walk through the same ending alone. I do not know what to call that, precisely. I have stopped trying to force it into a single word. I only know that when the Assembly asks me tonight whether I trust the alliance we are about to formalize, I will tell them the truth, the whole truth, the way Grace Holloway finally told me hers, once the cost of silence had grown too dangerous to keep paying. I will tell them I do not trust it because it is safe. I will tell them I trust it because I have watched, with my own eyes, exactly what these people choose to become when somebody finally asks them for help, and I have decided, the way they once decided, that I would rather stand beside that choice than anywhere else in the dark. Somewhere out past the edge of our star charts, the true monsters of the galaxy are still out there, waiting, patient as weather, unreasoning as fire. I am no longer afraid of facing them alone. I know exactly which 4 words to send into the dark, and I know, now, precisely who will answer.